So this is the Employment Rights Bill, which was first presented on the 10th of October this year by the Labour government. And there's been a lot of talk about this bill, and the concepts and ideas have been floating around for some time. However, the Labour government said that within the first 100 days of being in power, they would publish the recommendations, which are obviously subject to consultation, etc. And that's what they did, just within the 100 days that they promised. But that's only the start of the story. There's now some way to go in terms of getting some traction for these changes to try and make sure that industry and the workforce and the unions are all allied and on board with them, because there's no point introducing this legislation if it's not going to work or it's going to be deeply unpopular. Under the Employment Rights Bill, there are some seismic changes coming our way which employers need to be aware of, because that will affect the way in which they conduct their employment relations with their workforce and have some very dramatic effects in terms of the rights and responsibilities that they have and the duties to their employees from effectively day one of employment. In terms of the main changes, it's really to beef up and magnify employees' rights at work. There are 28 proposals in the first bill, and there's a possible 30 to follow in subsequent bills. And these are going to be very radical changes, possibly the biggest changes in a generation or two. And one of the main drivers is to give employees day one employment protection, which thus far they have not had in relation to unfair dismissal rights. As things currently stand, you would have to have 2 years continuous service before you are eligible to bring an unfair dismissal claim. Under this bill, from day one, you would have that protection, albeit it's subject to a probationary period, yet to be determined. We thought initially it was maybe 6 months, now it's probably more likely going to be 9 months, but again remains to be seen. And you would obviously be assessed during that 9-month period for your suitability for the job. And if you got through the probation, then it would be much harder for your employer to then fire you unless they had a very good reason and your performance had significantly declined such that you were underperforming and in dismissal territory. So that's one of the biggies, I think, to watch out for. And there are other day one rights. So far, you would have to have 6 months service before you could tap into parental or paternity leave or bereavement leave. Those rights will be from day one. There is already the right for employers to make flexible working requests, and under the bill that right is going to be beefed up so that it's going to be harder for an employer to refuse a flexible working request than it is at the moment. And they would potentially have to give some kind of hard evidence or reasons why. They do already, but the idea is that unless the request is totally unreasonable, the default position is that the employer should try and embrace it as far as possible. Inevitably, it's a difficult balance to strike to try and be pro-worker and pro-employer. Sometimes their objectives are aligned, but sometimes they're not. And I think there is going to be a tension here. Other big headlines from the bill are the very unpopular 0 hours contracts, which have been around for some time, and the government's very keen to try and get rid of those, basically. They won't eradicate them completely, so if a worker wants a 0 hours contract and it suits them because it suits the way that they want to work, they can still have it, but the employer won't be allowed to enforce a 0 hours contract on someone if they are working effectively regular hours in a sort of pattern of working behaviour. Then they won't be able to ride roughshod over them and say, well, you've got no job security, you've got no guaranteed hours. That's going to be out. The other legislation which has been unpopular is the firing and rehiring employees. So basically companies deciding that people are being paid too much, serving notice to terminate their existing contract of employment, and then rehiring them on less favourable terms, generally less pay. That practice will effectively be unlawful. It will be an automatic unfair dismissal if an employer tried that tactic, with a caveat that if there was a genuine reason behind it, and if, say, there was real financial trouble at the business, then maybe it would be permissible. But the baseline position is no, it would not be, and they would have to effectively avoid doing that kind of practice. Maternity rights are going to be enhanced. At the moment, a woman who goes on maternity leave is protected during her period of pregnancy and maternity leave, but under the bill, they'll also be protected for another 6 months after they return to work, so they can't be dismissed for a pregnancy-related reason during that 6-month period. So under the bill, employees will be entitled to statutory sick pay from the first day of sickness absence. They wouldn't have to wait 3 days as they do presently. The full detail of what these proposals will be and how they will actually present themselves is not yet fully understood. This is a little bit more like headline news, the headlines that they've presented in terms of these are the changes we want to make. And now what needs to happen is there needs to be some flesh on the bones so we understand how it will actually happen in practice. As to the timing of what happens and when it happens, that will remain to be seen and will be subject to consultation. The government have said the consultation period will start at the beginning of 2025. So yeah, I think probably early 2026 before we see any changes coming through. Not all of the changes will require primary legislation. Some of them, for example, the right to disconnect from work, which is something else which has carried some traction and interest, that may not require primary legislation. Companies and employers should prepare themselves for the probability that most of these changes will happen because the Labour Party has a very considerable majority in Parliament, so there's no reason why these things won't be passed. It's just a question of when. And I think in the meantime they should gear themselves up by getting their policies and procedures ready, in place, so that when it does happen, it's not a massive shock to the system.